President Obama has reportedly told Senate Democrats that he believes the House, led by Speaker John Boehner, will pass immigration reform this year. But in an election year, would that be a plus or minus for GOP candidates? Joining us now to discuss that and much more is the former Republican governor of Mississippi, Haley Barbour. Governor, good to see you today.
Thank you, Shannon. Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's talk about this issue because there's very much a split. I mean, we know by one report things have gotten so heated that the Speaker called Representative Steve King, who is much more conservative on this issue, by a word we can't repeat unless we want to get fined on the air. So clearly there is disagreement among the GOP about how to move forward on immigration. It's important in a 2014 midterm election year. What do they do?
Well, it's important for our country's future. I mean, we're in a global battle for capital and labor. And a lot of that labor, particularly we think of STEM-type labor, H-1B visas, comes from overseas. A lot of our agricultural labor comes from outside the United States. What the Republicans in the Senate can do is simply pass a series of bills. They don't have to pass one bill.
In the House.
Yeah, in the House. Pass a series of bills that is to the right of the Senate bill. And there's plenty of reason for that. The Senate bill doesn't do enough about border security. Border security needs to be strengthened. Visa enforcement needs to be strengthened. There are a lot of ways that you can pass a bill that is good for the country's economy, good for the country, that really tamps down border security and visa enforcement and make sure that the people who come here work and pay taxes and that they're actually good for the American fiscal situation. That's not a stretch at all. If they do that, I think a lot of people, maybe even Steve King, will say, hey, if we'd had this to talk about to start with, then I'd have felt a whole lot better about it.
And one of his main concerns, and those who oppose this whole idea of a massive form of immigration reform, is some pathway to citizenship, or some call it amnesty, that it would allow millions of workers. And you talk about the need for workers to fill a lot of positions, but they worry that it puts the American worker, where there are millions here underemployed or unemployed, desperately looking for work, that if we have an influx of cheap labor, it doesn't help average Americans. It stands to benefit those from the outside coming in.
You know, the biggest agricultural commodity in Mississippi is not cotton, it's actually chickens, it's broilers. If you go in a chicken processing plant in Mississippi or anywhere else in the United States, nobody in there speaks English. People from our state won't take those jobs. They're having to bring in labor to do that. 70% of the ag workers in California are not American citizens, and most of them are here illegally. We have to understand that. I mean, we need to grow our economy for sure. Steve King's right about that. Only 47% of adult Americans have a full-time job. But that's not because of immigration. That's because of a very bad economic policy by the Obama administration that has pushed people away from work. But we really need, as Republicans, to think about this. What is the right thing for our country's future? And then the politics will take care of itself.
All right, so with that in mind, let's talk about some polling. There have been recently the Quinnipiac poll. Are you more or less likely to vote for a legislator who supports a path to citizenship or amnesty? There's been a huge swing in there in the last few months. Now, 52% of those who say they're GOP voters say they are less likely to vote for someone who supports that kind of package. And when folks were asked in another poll to talk about their priorities for the president and for Congress, they were given all kinds of things: economy, deficit, health care. Immigration was on the list, and it ranked behind, quote, something else at 5%. Is this something that Republicans want to spend a lot of political capital on when it seems like it's not a priority for voters?
Well, I think that Boehner has the right idea in the House. Go through the regular process. Go through the committee process. Pass the bills, not one great big bill, but pass the bills that you think really improve the situation. And then you see what you take up by what you can pass. I don't think that it needs to be like the Senate, where they said, oh, we got to do this and we got to do it by some artificial deadline and it's got to be one bill. American people don't want that. But it needs to be. I'm not against a path to citizenship if the requirements are rigorous enough. If you did what we did in 1986, Americans are not going to vote for that. But let me just say, Shannon, in 1986, only about 40% of the people who could have become citizens chose to. So,
can we trust this government to enforce, even if the bill is full of all kinds of teeth? Will they be enforced?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I brought up border security. The Senate bill says we're going to spend all this money on border security. If it doesn't work, we're going to have a commission. The House, I think, is moving toward, here's what we're going to do to enforce the border. Here are the standards we're going to set. And unless those standards are met, we're not going to go forward with some of this other stuff. Now, I believe that we can set rigorous requirements that take Remember, the Senate bill, you have to go 10 years before you can even apply for a green card, and 3 more years. That's very long. There are a lot of things you have to do. But if the American people don't get border security, then they will say, you lied to me again. And the Republicans have to make sure border security actually happens.
And you know, there's a lot of distrust. Our polls always show us that there's a lot of mistrust about what's happening on the Hill. So the American people do need to be convinced as well. Governor, always good to see you.
Oh, Shannon,
Happy New
thank you
Year.
for having me.